Welcome to the Butt Fixer Podcast, brought to you by Shane Gentry and John Van Olden. Sit back, listen up, and listen good. You're going to hear it all right because we've already done it all wrong. We're going to help you meet your goals and fix your butts. Welcome to the Butt Fixer Podcast.
All right, here we are. Good morning. This is Moni Basu. Is that, I said it right? I
Yes,
checked
you
once
did.
before. Yeah. Moni is my friend Mike's girlfriend, Mike Wambacher, who is in California, my dog trainer buddy for, 25 years now or something like that. And Moni is a journalist and has an interesting story of where she's been and where she's going. So Mike touched on it during his interview with us, and I said, "Wow, she would be a great person to have on the podcast." So here she is.
Yeah.
She graciously agreed to come on with us.
We've been looking forward to this one for a while.
Mike, for sure.
Mike set you up nice.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So tell me, so you are, so now you're working as a journalist. You, how did you get started? And then we can talk about what you've done. I see plenty of, I can see plenty of photos behind you of, I can see a lot of places already without much description. So yeah, where are you from originally?
So I'll just try to be very short here with my life story, but basically I was left on the steps of an orphanage in Kolkata, which used to be known as Calcutta, India, when I was 1 day old.
What?
And I happened to be, I guess, I consider myself one of the luckiest people on earth because I was adopted a few days later. And it was really a chance meeting between the woman, my mother, and my mother really, who had met the woman who was running the orphanage, who happened to be an American missionary. And that's how my mother met her. They met at the Indo-American Society where my mother was learning English. And the missionary, her name was Helen Benedict, she told my mother that a newborn had been left at the orphanage, and my mother had tried to have children and had not been successful and wanted desperately to be a mother. And so she went to the orphanage. I don't know if it was the next day or sometime very soon. And I was adopted. And instead of a life in an orphanage, or perhaps I would have ended up in the slums of Calcutta somewhere. Instead of that, I was adopted by a professor, a very renowned professor. My father, in fact, I just finished writing a biography of him for a academic journal that is coming out in his honor. My father was a renowned mathematical and statistical theoretician. There is a Basu theorem named after him.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah. And so instead of the life, I don't know what my life would have been like, but I can imagine that it would not have been nearly as fortunate as the one that I have led. So my father liked to travel, and he liked to take visiting appointments at universities so that he could go places. And so when I grew up, every 18 months, 2 years, we were uprooted and moved again. I went to schools in England and all over the United States and Australia and India.
Wow.
We went to Lebanon and Japan and other places. So I grew up with at a very early age being exposed to the world, people who were very different than me, places that were very different than what I considered, in quotation marks, home, because I don't know where home was when I was growing up. And I think that instilled in me from a very early age this deep curiosity about other people. Other people. I just wanted to know more about their life experiences, and life experiences that were vastly different than my own. I had never really intended to become a journalist. My best grades were always in writing. I struggled through the sciences, but I did well in math because my father took the time to sit me down and explain things to me.
Mm-hmm.
But my real skills were in language and writing, especially. But I had never intended to become a journalist. I graduated from Florida State University with a bachelor's degree in political science, and then got a master's in international relations. And I had fully intended to join the diplomatic corps in some capacity, whether it was the Indian Foreign Service — I was an Indian citizen then —
Mm-hmm.
or my dream job had been maybe to one day work for a United Nations agency. But then on my 20th birthday, my mother had a massive stroke in 1982.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of changed the whole trajectory of my life in some ways. I stayed at home for the next couple of years, sort of taking care of her, helping to take care of her. And somewhere along the way, someone suggested that I write for a small community newspaper just to do something different and get out of the house. And I started reporting for a paper called the Florida Flambeau. It was once this Florida State University newspaper, but had gone off campus and was independent. And at that time was a feisty newspaper that was determined to sort of, expose authority for all the corruption and power of authority. And it was fighting for the little people, let's just put it that way.
All right.
And that's how I got started in journalism. And from the very first day, I loved it. And I never looked back, and I never considered anything else that I was going to do. Again, that was it. I became editor of that paper, and then went on to hold various jobs, and ended up in Atlanta in 1990 at the Atlanta Constitution, now the Journal-Constitution. I worked there for 19 years, and then at CNN for almost a decade.
That's right. That's right. I don't know why in my mind I was thinking Washington Post, but that's right. Now I remember Atlanta. So but home is in Florida for you now, right?
No, I live in Atlanta.
Okay.
In 2018, I was working at CNN. I had a pretty great job. I was on the enterprise team, which meant we did long form magazine style written pieces. I'm a writer.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a TV journalist. I got to go travel all over the world, really, and cover big breaking stories like the Haiti earthquake, the Nepal earthquake, the Iraq War, other stories. I reported a lot from my homeland, India. But in 2018, I just decided I was getting a little bit too old to traipse across the globe carrying a lot of gear. And I had started teaching as an adjunct in 2011. And in 2015, one of my dear friends, Valerie Boyd, launched an MFA program in a narrative nonfiction at the University of Georgia. And I was teaching part-time in that program. And in 2018, I decided to teach full-time and do journalism as a freelance gig part-time instead of the other way around.
Right.
And so I got a job at the University of Florida. It was a great job developing their writing program there, and spent 4.5 years there. And then what happened was my friend Valerie, she had pancreatic cancer, and she died in 2022. And so then I returned to Atlanta to take over that program.
Okay. Wow. So, go ahead, Shane.
Yeah, I got to just before we get too far away from it. I really got some questions about your childhood. I'm an adoptive parent, so that really hit home with me. What was? I mean, I know orphanage life is not good, but like, is it? Have you ever reached that? Like, have you ever met your biological parents?
So in the late 1990s, I attempted to find out more about the circumstances of my birth. Let me just preface all that by saying that I had a very happy childhood. I run across people all the time, and I've run across people in my journalism career who I see all sorts of abuse and neglect and people who grew up in homes without any love at all. And I had the best childhood ever. I couldn't have dreamed of a better childhood.
Yeah.
And so as such, I never really had this desire to even find out,
Okay.
But then in the 1990s, I was in my 30s, and I also had one of my dear friends gave up a child for adoption, and so I was very close to her and knew all the circumstances of her story. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to try to find out more. I did go back to that orphanage in Calcutta. It had been turned into a senior home by then. It was no longer an orphanage. The caretaker at the orphanage remembered me. He didn't remember me. He remembered a baby being left at their doorstep. But then he told me there had been a fire at the orphanage, so all the records were gone. Everything had burned. And now it was an old people's home, a senior home, and nothing was left of the orphanage. I tried to find Helen Benedict, the woman who ran that orphanage. Edward and Helen Benedict were American missionaries in India in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. I used all my journalism skills to try to track her down, and I did find her daughter. But by the time I found her daughter, Helen had died, and the daughter told me that any records that they might have had from India, I mean, she got rid of everything. She cleaned out her parents' house. So that was kind of it. India at that time, I was adopted in 1962. At that time, there was a thing called the Hindu Adoption Act. And that basically what the act said was you can adopt a child, and all you have to do is put kind of an ad out in the newspaper for 7 days saying, I'm adopting this baby. If anyone objects, speak now, forever hold your peace. And,
really?
And I still have the newspaper. My dad saved the newspaper ads for me. I have those. But other than that, I have no birth certificate. I have no adoption certificate. My parents have no marriage certificate. So it was very, very hard to do a document search, and so it kind of just all ended there.
I would
think,
it would be
so like, even if you, because I mean, if you're going to find them, like you would have the skills to do so, like there's a show on, like, I think it's called Long Lost Family, where they, these people, find people's parents and things like that, or siblings or what have you for them. I just didn't know, like, I know you, even with a great childhood growing up, like, does that show up in your daily life or your thoughts, or do you like, is it just kind of like you had a great life or have a great life and it's good, or you kind of every now and again sort of go, damn, I really wish I knew if I had sisters or brothers or et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think more than that, what really drives me is this notion that I was exceptionally fortunate to have had the life that I did, and that so many others are not. And I think that has always been a part of why I want to write about people whose stories might not otherwise be told.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's awesome.
It's interesting. My granddaughter's my daughter's grandfather is from Pakistan. It's kind of a similar story. He was raised at a Christian monastery, and they ended up like pooling their resources. They decided, okay, we want to send this kid to the United States, and it's the story you always hear. Put him on a boat by himself. He gets here. He has an address on a piece of paper. He goes there. He ended up in Philadelphia. Met my daughter's grandmother, who immigrated from Germany after the war, East Germany, what became East Germany after the war, and here they are. So on one side, she has a full family tree. On the other side, there's not a lot of branches on there for her.
Yeah.
And my kid's mother, my kid's uncle, her mother's brother, they're like math geniuses. My kid's got she won valedictorian in her school in mathematics, and so that's coming from somewhere, but it sure isn't me. That's for sure. So she might get a few other things.
1 beer, 2 beers, 3 beers.
Exactly.
Can't remember how many beers.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
So-
you asked me if I think about things. Every time I go to a doctor's office, I have to fill out, that part that says family history.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And, I always have to write N.A. And I just don't know anything about, that's when I do think about it. Like, what if there's cancer in my family?
Right.
I've never know any of those things. But yeah, I sometimes wonder if there's somebody out there who's related to me, a sibling, or but I'm not like I'm not consumed by it. No.
Right. Yeah. That's kind of what I was, because as raising, having adopted a son, I was always like, as the parent side, boy, there were some things that I was dreading ever hearing or hoping that I never or like you're not my dad, or whatever, something like that would just crush me. But thankfully, my son, my oldest son, he has actually met his biological dad, and gave me the nod and said, I'm glad you're my dad.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
But it's man, it's just so sorry, I know we got lots of stuff to talk about, but that just really at the surface for me, when how you manage on either side, being the parent or the child, of adoption. So thanks for opening up about that a little bit more. That was it really does create that drive.
So how does the travel, was this, I love to travel, but my travel is like, go here, go there, find a pub, blah, blah, blah. I'm the type of traveler. I'm not the guy that, goes out on the tour buses and everything. I walk around and try to get see what it's like. What's it like to live here? What are the people like, blah, blah, blah. So, is that, how does that, do you travel much now, or like for yourself, or not so much?
Yeah, my friends always tease me. They say, we can't keep up with you on Facebook. It seems like you're in a different place every week. Yes, I love to travel. I get stir crazy if I am sitting here in Atlanta for months at a time and I haven't been somewhere else. I love to see new places, and I'm like you. I don't like to do those guided tours. I like to just kind of get lost almost, and figure my way around the city. I like to go to places that are very different than where I live, and I try to, understand what life is like for folks over there. And
right,
that's one part of my. I really miss being a reporter for that reason, a full-time reporter. When I was working at CNN, I got to travel a lot, not just, domestically, but internationally. And I miss that. Now I got to I got to pay for my plane ticket.
Yeah, that part probably sucks.
That definitely.
Yeah.
Now you gotta look and go, can I really go there?
Yeah, exactly.
But on the other hand, I'm not working when I go someplace, so
That's true.
That's a relief. But yeah, I try to do at least one big international trip every year. I'm thinking now about. I went to India earlier this year with my best friend Jan.
Mhm.
I have had lots of friends over the years say, "I want to go to India with you," and none of them have really stepped up to the plate. But Jan did, and that was really an amazing experience for both of us. I mean, she had never been to India, but I had never had a friend from here ever meet my family or my friends in India. And
Mhm.
it was always that disconnect. You know, I grew up straddling two cultures, and I think I really struggled with that in my 20s and 30s, who I was as my identity. You know, what did it mean to be an Indian woman who grew up here? You know, I went through a phase where I kind of rejected my culture and my Indianness, and now it's taken many years. I'm 62, I'm going to be 62 soon, and it's taken a long time for me to fully embrace who I am. But yeah, that trip to India was very meaningful. I went to Morocco earlier this year, and then I'm now thinking about going back to Iraq. I have a friend from Iraq. She lives in Canada now, and she's thinking about going home this fall or this winter, and I'm trying to see if I can make a trip work.
Wow.
How's I love Indian food. Is it? I know what we probably get here is probably not as authentic as what you might get there, but like how's the? Because I mean, one of my favorite things to do on Facebook is just scroll Indian street food, watching them. You know, some of it looks like like he just stuck his bare hands in there and just slapped it on a plate. It's like, I'm not eating that shit. But but is it? I can imagine it's got to be spectacular at the source.
Yeah, well, I grew up eating Indian food. And
Yeah.
I mean, saying Indian food is very strange because we have regional cuisines. We
Right.
don't have Indian food, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
So a lot of the food you get in Indian restaurants in the United States is all North Indian, Punjabi food.
Punjabi, yeah.
Tandoori chicken and
right.
I mean, chicken tikka masala is a British invention. It's not even Indian.
Really?
Indian, yeah. So, but the food we eat at home. I come from Calcutta, Bengali food. I've yet to find that kind of food in a restaurant here. And so what I enjoy most is when one of my friends or somebody cooks for me, because then I get the homemade food and I didn't have to cook it because I don't like eating my own food. I like it when somebody else makes it for me. So that's another joy of going home for me, because when I go home, I get invited to everyone's houses for lunch or dinner, and it's
right.
The food is something I really miss. And you mentioned street food. Oh my God, India is like, there's so much street food that it will make your head spin. And yes,
right.
I mean, I didn't let my friend Jan eat any of that because I think you can get really sick if you're not used to it.
Yeah.
But, I think I have a certain amount of immunity from eating it for all those years. I have yet to get deathly ill from eating, street food in India. So
are there like if some of the stuff and again, I'm just watching stupid little clips online and no context of the what's really going on in the culture or that, but like some of that stuff looks pretty freaking unsanitary. Like if they tried to do that here, like they would get shut down. Are there any standards for them to have to kind of guidelines to abide by?
Not for street food, no.
Just roll with
it. Yeah. I mean, the big joke was, the dirtier somebody's hands are, the tastier the food will be.
Oh my God.
So,
I've actually said that because, like, I'm like when you go into a little pub or a dive bar or a little greasy spoon, like if the sanitation rating's like an 80. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's funny.
Oh,
So how growing up, you're traveling. That was because of your father or your parents had that's what they did. So you'd spend a year here, 18 months there, whatever, right? Did that experience? I know it helped you when you began traveling internationally as a journalist, but did it actually help you land that gig? That I have experience here and I have experience there, and I've lived here and lived there. Does that, because I think there's a lot of people that you drop them somewhere new, they don't know what to do, right?
Oh, well, I mean, it helped me in the sense that from a very early age, I was forced to adapt, right? It's not easy when you're a kid being moved around that much, starting with, of course, the most obvious barriers, which are language. But then as a kid, all you want to do is fit in, right? You don't want to be the oddball out.
Right.
And it's hard to fit in when you've come from a totally different place. And so when we were kids, my brother and I'm not sure we liked being uprooted all the time. For instance, I can tell you, when I was going to school in Manchester, England, I loved going to school there. School was fascinating to me there because there was so much available. I learned how to play the violin and piano. I played in an orchestra at school. I was a brownie and I was going to become a Girl Scout, and I did all sorts of stuff. And it all came to a crashing halt when we went back to India, right? Because in the schooling was so different there. And then, of course, when we would go back to India, we went back to India every 18 months or so, or 2 years, because my dad missed home and he was tied to a very well-known institute, the Indian Statistical Institute, and he just felt the draw of home. So he would go, do a gig somewhere, and then when it was over, we would go back to India. And I mean, I appreciate that now because I don't have the typical immigrant experience of coming over as a child and then losing touch with my culture. I grew up, enmeshed in both cultures. But the difficulty of it was, when we would go back home, getting into a good school in India is very hard. It's very competitive. And we would get admitted to schools, and the principal would tell my parents, look, we're going to admit your children, but they're failing in Hindi, Bengali, Sanskrit, the languages, right? So you have to bring them up to par. Otherwise, they can't continue. And so we would have tutors come to the house, and all our friends were out playing. There we were sitting there studying Bengali and Hindi, trying to, you can imagine when you're in the third grade and you leave the country for 2 years and you come back and you're in fifth grade, but you had no language instruction for 2 years, you're way behind. Yeah. And so that was hard. But now I realize how instructive that was, because I can speak the languages. I am, I wouldn't have learned them otherwise. And as you all know, I mean, it's very difficult to learn a language as an adult, especially one that's that different.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm very appreciative of the experience I had now. I mean, now looking back on it, at the time, I think it was kind of crazy. It was very confusing at times. And most of all, it was just, trying to fit in everywhere we went. We ended up in Perth, Australia in 1975. And I was in, 8th grade at Hollywood High School. And I was sitting there in geography class. I didn't know the first thing about Australian geography or Australian history. And it was so hard I would have to go home and, read extra stuff that other kids weren't reading. It was just very disorienting at the time. But now I feel very lucky to have had those experiences.
Yeah. Bill Bryson.
How many languages can you speak now with all your traveling? over the years?
Oh, I try to speak English.
Sounds pretty good. I understand.
You're doing fine.
I mean, I speak, Bengali and Hindi, and my degree is in Latin American studies. So at one time I was proficient in Spanish, but I mean, I can get around somehow, but my Spanish isn't very good. At one time I learned French, but I've lost a lot of that too. It's like if you don't speak it, you lose it.
Yeah.
I tried very hard to learn Arabic during my years going to the Middle East, and but that too I've lost, because I'm not exposed to it on a daily basis.
Right.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. You went to Morocco. What were you using? I was there a few years ago, and it was French and Arabic. So I was like back and forth with translator. Geez, my French is like forget it. Arabic, really forget it.
Yeah. No, I know we had I had a translator there.
You did.
It was I couldn't. I mean, the French I could understand a lot better than the Arabic, but not my French isn't good enough to really converse in.
So what was your first, your very first from the Florida, from going from the Florida paper that you were running, and then going over to, you said Atlanta Journal-Constitution first, right?
Yeah, I had a couple other jobs in between, but yeah, I came to the Constitution in 1990. And at that time, my goal was just to get out of Tallahassee because I'd lived there for a long time and I wanted to move back to a more cosmopolitan area and or move to a more cosmopolitan area. So I told myself, no matter what job I get, I'm going to take it and go.
Yeah.
And so the job I got was not really what I wanted. It was a copy editing job. But I had friends here in Atlanta who had moved from Tallahassee. And so I decided it was going to be a good move. I took that job. And I started off as a copy editor. And then that was in early November of 1990. A few months later, the Gulf War broke out. And suddenly I found they needed people who could do page design and be news editors on the front page desk, and so I got moved over to that. And soon after that, I was what we call a 1A editor, the front page editor of the Atlanta Constitution, of the front page editors. At a very young age, I was 27 when I started working at the Constitution, and then I held a variety of jobs there. But what I really wanted to do was go back to reporting. And it took several years for me to go back to reporting full time. But eventually I did. In the late 1990s, my parents were both very sick in India. And I did a lot of reporting from India. I would take unpaid leave and go to India and just, sort of freelance stories back to the Constitution. And then in 2001, both my parents died, and then 9/11 happened, and 2001 was a dreadful year for me. And then, of course, the war in Afghanistan started, and then it was obvious that there was going to be war in Iraq, and I just started covering all of that stuff. And I did other things too. I covered the presidential election in 2004. That was quite an experience. That was when John Kerry and John Edwards were on the Democratic ticket against the Bush-Cheney team. And that I had never covered a presidential election. I'd written stories about issues and things, but I'd never covered an election like day to day with a candidate. I started off, they assigned me to cover Wesley Clark, who, was running in the primaries. And boy, that was like a grueling assignment because, the thing about covering a candidate like that is you don't sleep in the same bed twice. you're just constantly moving from
Yeah.
place to place to
Yeah.
place. And they're long days, and then you have to go back to your hotel room and actually write a story and file it
Right. Right.
while the candidate's gone to sleep. And
Right.
then they're waking up at 5 a.m. And so you got to be up at 5 a.m. to get back on the bus. And I just couldn't imagine doing that now. I'd be dead in 2 days. But it takes an enormous amount of energy to do that. But it was quite an experience.
Yeah.
Is there any difference in how you? Oh, sorry, John. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I mean, just from television, I look at like these people that are out there reporting, and I'm like, man, I mean, it seems like, I mean, that's for a lot of journalists, I think that's like top of the food chain. You're traveling all over the world. You're doing this, you're covering a campaign, you're doing everything else. But the amount of work and the amount of the lack of sleep, that's what I always think about. I'm like, Jesus, these people, when do they go to bed? I always like weird, what do they eat? Like you have no time to do anything. And if somebody says go, you got to jump up and go, right? It's got to be.
This is why I get pretty upset when, people attack journalists, and, the former president called journalists enemies of the people. And that was very, very unsettling for me, because I think journalists are some of the hardest working folks here. I mean, they take so many risks. I mean, it doesn't, you don't have to be traipsing off to war zones. It's like, let's just take the big story of the week now, which was Hurricane Helene, which, devastated parts of my state, Georgia. And we've all seen the images that are coming out of Western North Carolina now. I mean, journalists don't have to go there. I mean, that's a choice they make to go there to cover the story. And they're taking risks with their own lives. They're on the road, as you said, their days are long. It's not comfortable covering stories like that. And not to mention just interviewing people who have suffered so much, I mean, there is this thing called, secondhand trauma, where you can start absorbing the trauma of the
I can
people,
imagine.
people that you're talking to. And there are journalists I know who have covered one traumatic story after another, and that weighs on them at some point. So, I mean, I think that, I know that the state of the industry is in disarray right now. No one can figure out, a good business model moving forward, now that print newspapers are obviously going to be a thing of the past. And nobody's really figured out how to monetize what we were doing in the digital age. But I think somebody will at some point. Technology is changing very rapidly, and it's been hard to keep up with that changing technology. And the latest thing now is, in the 1990s, we had this thing called the internet that came along and kind of destroyed the whole, the model of news delivery that we had, and forced the industry to change. And now we have this thing called AI that's coming up, and forcing the journalism industry to reconsider how things are done. AI is obviously going to be, I have friends who are like, no, AI is going to be the end of us. I'm like, no, it's not going to be the end of us. It's going to become another tool that we use. And it's just a matter of like how we use that tool in a sensible and ethical way. And so I just think that there's always going to be a need for journalism, though, in America, because, the Fourth Estate, as we're known, is one of the pillars of our democracy. The Washington Post motto is "Democracy dies in darkness." And if you look at the world's most authoritarian countries, all the autocracies of the world, none of them have a free press. It's essential for a dictator to stay in power, is to shut down the free press. And so I find what's happening in America, this distrust of journalism, the attacks on journalism, I find that to be deeply, deeply disturbing. Like anyone who is interested in preserving our democracy would say that attacking journalism in America is also a threat to democracy, posing a threat to democracy.
I mean, we could go down a rabbit hole there, which, you know, I'm
Yeah.
not sure I want to, but
Sorry.
it has
I
a lot.
talked too long.
It has a lot to it has a lot to do with like who is believing, who is out there believing the things that these people are saying, that, you know, journalists are enemies of the state and everything else. You know, you nobody takes the time anymore to, you know, to, okay, I'm going to read a different point of view. I'm going to do this. I'm going to look into that. How does all that work? So I don't know. You're right. And real quick on AI, it's funny. We just had somebody on yesterday that's a history writer, and he was talking about AI, and he actually talked about it the same way. He talked about it as it's a tool. It's something that he often uses as kind of, okay, I'm going to put this in, I'm going to plug it in, I'm going to take a look at it, I'm going to use that as a draft, and then I'm going to take that and actually write it. You know, now in our business, and, you know, we have nothing to do with journalism, but I've had people that I hire copywriters, content writers. They write content. You can tell when it's AI, and if they give me AI content, my assistant will immediately go in and rewrite it and everything, because it just has to. Yeah. So it is a good tool. It's like anything. It's like power steering, right? Why would you want to drive a car with, you know, manual steering when you could get one with power steering? But it doesn't mean that you don't have to know how to drive. You still need to know how to steer the car. Just a minute, Shane. I have one quick question.
Yeah.
So tell me, when you went to India and you were like, okay, I'm gonna file some freelance stories, are you just looking like let me find something to report on and send them, or are they giving you guidance and we're looking like, can you send us any of this? Do you have an editor that's doing that? I mean, how do you sell your story to get paid, you know, mainly?
Well, I mean, most of the time that I reported from India, I was employed by somebody, either the Atlanta Constitution or CNN. I did a lot of reporting for CNN from India. And so those stories were, most of those stories were my ideas, you know,
Okay.
talking to my editor, brainstorming, you know, ideas, looking at the news of the day. What are the issues of the day, and then coming up with stories. I'll give you an example. I think one of the hardest stories I've ever reported and written was a story I did in 2013. In 2012, in December of 2012, a young woman in New Delhi was gang raped on a public bus, and her injuries were so severe that she died later in a Singapore hospital. And that sparked this global outcry against sexual assault of women, especially in India. And I kept seeing all these headlines that said, India, the rape capital of the world. And I went to my editor at CNN, and I told her, I said, you know, I don't like all these stories because they're just so simplistic. They're just, you know, not looking at what the real situation is in India. And then I came upon this headline in the Hindustan Times, which is one of the leading English language newspapers in India, that mentioned this woman, Mathura, whose case, she was the first woman to take her rape case all the way through the courts, and it went through all the way up to the Supreme Court of India. And that case actually became a landmark case that helped change sexual assault laws, spawned the modern day women's movement in India. So suddenly it occurred to me, like, I remembered that case, and I was like, well, what happened to this woman? I mean, so much was written about her, and people are referencing her, you know, now in the aftermath of this other horrific rape. But what happened to her? And so I decided I would find her. And finding someone like that in India is not easy. I mean, she lives in a remote
Yeah.
village in the middle, in the interior of India. You don't just like Google her and find her.
Right.
So India is a land of 1.4 billion people,
Yeah.
most of whom live in these small, villages, with many of whom don't even have electricity still. So, my editor was very open to the idea. We pitched the story, and she said, "Well, the thing is, you have to find her." And or at least try very hard to find her. And so I, with the help of folks in the New Delhi bureau and a freelancer on the ground, we were able to figure out what area she would probably be in. And I went and I decided that even if I don't find her, I'm going to write about my journey to find her. And through her story,
Yeah.
through my journey, you would find out how far India has come in those 40 years and what is the situation on the ground now, and I remember I went to New Delhi. I covered the sentencing of the men who had gang raped that woman. They were all sentenced to death.
Jesus,
And then
yeah.
I went from New Delhi to this place and ended up finding her and ended up writing a very personal story about which incorporated my own experience with sexual assault. And it was the hardest story I've ever written, and I couldn't have written it without having the most understanding and talented editor I've ever worked with. She's now one of my dearest friends, my best friend, the one who went to India with me. But she was my editor for many years at the Atlanta Constitution and at CNN. But that was an idea that I had, that I brainstormed with my editor and sold it to CNN, and they sent me there. And most of the stories I've done from India are like that. It's not that anyone has said, go write a story about this. Now, with breaking news, it's different. Like when the Nepal earthquake happened,
Right.
CNN did say, can you get on a plane and go now?
Wow. Yeah. Wild.
I used to have a bag packed all the time because that was the nature of the beast. You never knew when something was going to happen, and when I would get a call saying get on the next plane to wherever. So but when you cover breaking stories like that, when I went to Nepal, I ended up going back to Nepal the next year to do some follow-up stories on people I had met. That's the best way to get larger stories, when you're on the ground actually witnessing some terrible event that's happening in front of you.
Mm-hmm. That's crazy.
So, how do you mentioned earlier, being a writer, not like a TV, like a reporter. Is there a difference in the way that you prepare your story for just written versus what you would if you had to be on camera and present the story as a news anchor type person? Is there a difference in how you would write those stories or the content of those stories?
Absolutely. So, in 2009, when I left the Atlanta paper and went to CNN, I was in my late 40s, and I had to suddenly reinvent myself. I'd start all over again. Suddenly I was working for the world's largest cable news network, and I had never done a video story. I had never I'd been on television, been interviewed on television, but I'd never produced a documentary for television or a TV story. So it was a steep learning curve. I had to learn all over again how to tell stories. The major difference with print and TV journalism or audio journalism, right? In audio journalism, you have to tell the story through tape, the sound that you have. In video journalism, you have to consider what images you have. And that's what shapes the way you tell the story. In print, you're free to write it however you want because you're not beholden to sound or images, right? And so it's a totally different way of telling the story. And I had to learn on the job doing it. I'd
Right.
never had any training in it. And it was I'd never thought of my stories visually, but I was forced to think of them visually. And actually that helped me strengthen my writing,
Gotcha.
because, you have to think a lot more cinematically when you're doing video stories, right? But in print, there's no camera rolling, so you have to describe what the camera would be seeing. And so it's interesting. They all go hand in hand, but they're different. And I at CNN, many times for instance, when they sent me to Nepal, when they sent me to Haiti, when they sent me to, I covered the Ferguson story when Michael Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And suddenly I had to do like live stand-up shots and go on TV to talk about, the day's events. And I didn't know how to do any of that. I learned by doing. And I'm glad I had that experience, but I was nervous for sure.
Right. So have you, and you don't have to name any names if this has actually happened. I'm just curious. In all of the stories that you've covered, I would imagine you've probably seen some things that the people that you were covering didn't want out there. Like, have you ever been in a position where has anybody ever tried to like on the sly and go, hey man, don't print that shit, I mean, like, have you, and if you were in that position, like, how did you handle it? Did you say, hey, this is going to be a pure story and it's going in there? Or do you sometimes go, okay, I won't say that?
So I think it all depends on who you're dealing with. If I'm talking to a public official who is well-versed in how journalism works and you do an interview that's on the record, they can't later say, oh, don't put that in the story because they said it, But if it's an ordinary person who doesn't really understand how all of this works, what on the record means or anything like that, and later they come to me and say, I talked about, these things that happened to me, but I really don't want them out there. Could we talk about, the interview? I will talk to them about it. I'm not in the business of, going
like,
out to hurt people,
Yeah.
That's not what I'm doing. That's not the kind of journalism I do. And then when you're reporting from, let's say, when I was reporting on the Iraq War, I had all sorts of security concerns to take into consideration. If somebody's speaking to me openly about something that happened in their village, I have to think about whether I'm going to identify that person because they may become a target of insurgents or warring factions.
Wow. That's a whole nother level. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, and some people don't realize that, right? I often had to talk people out of saying, that they wanted to be identified because they didn't truly understand. They didn't wholly understand the consequences of that interview being in the story. So there's all sorts of, for instance, somebody who's been the victim of sexual assault or domestic violence. We don't name people. We shield their identities. So I think it just all depends on the circumstances, but sure, that happens all the time, the time.
Yeah.
So, and you kind of touched on my next question was the on the record, off the record thing. Like, is that just a kind of a moral code against journalists or amongst journalists that you just, if somebody says it's off, like what, if somebody's talking to you and you're doing an interview and it's on the record, so to speak, but they say something and go, this is off the record, but what they say like opens up some crazy scandal or a admission of guilt of sorts. Are you obligated as a journalist to, even though they said it off the record, quote unquote, like how do you navigate that?
If something is said off the record, it's off the record. You cannot use it. You just cannot use it. And this is why I tell all my students, you should try very, very hard to never be in that position. Never allow someone to say, okay, I want to go off the record now. Try to convince them to stay on the record. Or try to convince them to say, okay, I won't quote you on this, but maybe you can tell me this information on background. So if somebody tells you something on background, you can still use the information. You just can't attribute it to somebody, right? Oftentimes you'll see stories in the New York Times or Washington Post or CNN that they'll say something like, the New York Times has learned that the United States is planning to bomb Tehran tomorrow. And that means that the reporter has talked to somebody high up, State Department or the White House, and they've learned this information, but it's been given to them on background, and they cannot then say, according to Secretary of State, blah, 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 right? And so but if somebody says something off the record, you cannot use that information at all. You cannot.
Really?
And that's
but like,
why,
is that like law, or is that just code?
Ethics, yeah.
Yeah. Cause like, what if somebody said, like, I don't know, I'm just dreaming up some weird scenario. Like, if you were investigating, like a murder or something, I don't know, and I didn't do that. I don't remember. But when your cameras are off and your pen's down, they go, man, I totally killed that dude. Like, I mean, like, what would you do with it? You can't take that like to the police or to something and go, hey, he told me he killed him, or whatever the case was.
Yeah, that's a really tough situation. I mean, I don't think it's like, like being somebody's lawyer where you're, you have to keep your silence on things that are told to you confidentially, or somebody's therapist. But if something is told to you off the record, that is the rule. You cannot use that in your story. And that's why journalists don't like to go there. Like if I've done interviews where people have said, can I tell you something off the record? I will say, no, actually, let's try to, I don't know what you're going to tell me, but is there any way you can tell it to me on background? I won't quote you on it, but I will know this then, and so I just try very hard not to let people say that. You're just putting yourself in a really tricky position.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, especially you got to carry that around, knowing the truth under what they're putting out. I don't know. That would make me crazy.
Well, yeah, so I have a similar question. Now, all these things come up in my mind, which I never thought. See, I told you we just hit record and see what happens. What about, okay, you're embedded with a campaign, or you're embedded with wherever, right? I mean, you're out there and you see things. You see like this. I mean, I don't even want to. I can think, you told me some of the campaigns. You told me one campaign you were embedded in. I mean, I think that it's possible that there are reporters that are around. You're around all the time, and you see things that would probably be best if they're not brought to light. They're not part of an interview. It's just you're there. Or somebody else saw something, or you're talking with your colleagues, and hey, man, I saw this guy do this, or I saw this person, whatever. I mean, or I heard them talking. Things that are going on that are not like part of an interview. I mean, you're just kind of, you're a fly on the wall, right? A lot of times. Can you report on that? It becomes a story somewhere else. Then do you comment on it? How does that all work?
Well, I mean, I can give you my an example of when I was embedded with an Army infantry unit in Iraq, right? I spent months with the same unit. I got to know the guys. At some point I was like invisible to them. I was just hanging out. I would go I'd go to the chow hall with them, the mess hall. I would hang out with them when there wasn't anything happening, when we weren't out on a combat mission, or when I wasn't actually reporting a story. I was, what are you going to do? I'm hanging out there and living there among them, right? So, but the thing that I was very careful about is I always carried around my notebook. I mean, obviously, because at any point something could happen, but also as to serve as a reminder, hey, I'm not here as your buddy. I'm here as the reporter. And okay, we're not doing a formal interview, but everything you're saying and doing in front of me is considered fair game.
Okay.
Right? I was a reporter embedded with that unit. Now, would I use my discretion? Like, obviously, if somebody's if we're hanging out late at night and they're cutting up and they're telling all sorts of bad jokes or making fun of something, I don't know. Am I going to write a story about that and out people for something that is not really relevant or whatever? No, of course not. I wouldn't do that. But uh, I, I, I do think it's very important for journalists who are in that situation, whether you're covering a presidential campaign or whether you're embedded with a military unit or, sometimes journalists spend months and months and months with the same people. That's in the kind of work I do in narrative nonfiction, it's called immersive reporting, where you're spending so much time with one person or a group of people. It's very easy for the lines to get blurred. What capacity are you there in? But I think it's as a journalist, it's incumbent upon you to keep reminding those people that you are there as a reporter. I'm not going to Iraq to have fun with you guys. Right. I'm there. I'm not a soldier. I'm there to report on you. That's my role. And no matter what the situation is, I am a journalist first. So, I think it's very important to keep reminding people. I mean, you guys remember the story in Rolling Stone about General Stanley McChrystal, the Michael Hastings story, where he outed McChrystal and his guys, and they were on a layover in Paris, I think, and I think there had been some alcohol involved, and things were said with Hastings in the room. And Michael Hastings had spent quite a bit of time with these folks in Afghanistan, and I guess they let their guard down, or they, forgot for a minute that Michael Hastings was a reporter. There was a lot of criticism of him after that story came out, whether he should have written the things he did. But I felt like, okay, those people, and especially those people, they were high up Army folks. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what the rules were with a reporter. It wasn't just some grunts out in the field. So, but I do think it's important for journalists to keep reminding people, I'm here to report on your story, report your story. I'm not here to hang out with you or to have fun with you or to help you in any way. My job is to tell your story. Okay. That's why I'm here.
So, but you could conceivably, I mean, then I would think there'd be an ethics, like a personal ethics thing involved where, okay, these guys blew it. They said all kinds of crazy shit. What do I do? I could report on it because, like you said, it's fair game. But if I report on it, I may lose all my access moving forward. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So it depends on how important you think the information is. And in the case of the McChrystal story, obviously Hastings thought it was important enough to publish. But listen, I've heard all sorts of things, from all sorts of people that have never made it into my stories, because I just don't. It's like, what is the point of publishing this? Am I just going to publish it because I got it? What is the, somebody told me something, but and anyway, if you're getting some earth-shattering information, it's up to you to check it out anyway before you report it. But right. I have never, just printed things just for the sake of, fact that I just because I got the information. I can give you another example. In 2005, I was embedded with the Georgia Army National Guard, the 48th Brigade, that was called up for the first time since World War II. And it was a very big deal. There were 4,500 soldiers in that brigade. Wow. And it was like, suddenly all these small Georgia towns were losing their sheriff's deputies and firemen and police officers and teachers and truck drivers. And it was a very big story here in Georgia. And so I spent a lot of time with that brigade. And in 2005, when I got to Baghdad, within days, the unit that I was with, they lost 8 guys. And one of the guys from that platoon, came into my tent one night and just started talking to me about what he had seen and what he was feeling. It was very dark stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember telling my editor what had happened, and we talked about why, he probably felt safe talking to a woman about this stuff. Maybe, I don't know, but I never printed any of that. I just hung on to that. And because I knew that in that moment it was raw and he was emotional, and what he was saying may have all been true, or his truth anyway at that time, but I had no way of verifying everything he was saying. And also, I didn't want to put it out there and get him into trouble, or make him, I don't know what the reaction would have been from his other people in his unit, his commanding officer, all of that stuff. But, the thing is, because I didn't print it, I was able to establish trust with him. And he appreciated that. And we ended up talking for long hours. And many years later, when he was in trouble, when he ended up in jail, that's when he said, all that stuff we talked about and we have been talking about for years, I want you to print all of that now.
Wow.
And so the story finally came out in 2012. So 7 years after he first talked to me. I held on to those notebooks. But that's part of being a good journalist also, is knowing that somebody's trusting you enough to tell you all this information. Now, are you in such a hurry to print this stuff, or are you going to wait until the time is right, until you've been able to check it out, until it's a richer story?
Mm-hmm. I had another.
Good.
So you brought up in embedding, like with the National Guard unit and everything. The first time you did that, was that something like that? Was that in the first Gulf War time, or was that the Afghanistan?
No. The first time I started covering Iraq in 2002, I went before the war.
Mm-hmm.
That was a different kind of scary experience under Saddam Hussein. And then I went in 2003. I wasn't embedded. I went with a photographer, just the two of us. Just a few days after the bombing of Baghdad stopped, we drove in from Jordan. And then my first embedded trip was in 2005. This trip that I am telling you about, because the 48th Brigade had just been called up. So I covered their training at Fort Stewart. They trained for many, many months. I mean, they hadn't been just called. They had been called up many months before, but they were in training at Fort Stewart. They didn't deploy until June of 2005. And so when they deployed, that was my first embedded trip. I wasn't embedded during the war. It's the actual invasion itself. Yeah.
Okay.
And so then after that, I went back to Iraq many times, and some trips I was embedded, and other trips I wasn't embedded.
Okay. So I as a military person, I actually was stationed at Fort Stewart years ago. So you're with them in training and everything. Are you going through training? You have to go through some training. You have to know how things work, right? They don't say, okay, go tomorrow, get your bag. You're going to wherever, right?
Well, the Army did not put me through any. I mean, they didn't come to me and say, well, you can't embed with this unit unless you pass A, B, C, D. But I thought it wasn't very prudent of me to go be in some of these situations if I didn't know what was going on, or if I didn't have some sense of what to do, right?
Yeah, that's
so,
what I was thinking.
At some point, I actually decided that I would try to do the Army PT test to see if I could pass it.
Okay.
And then I also the paper had put me through what is called hostile environment training.
Okay.
And it's a week's worth of training. The one that I've been to several of them, but that first one that I went to was put on by former British special ops guys, and British and Australian special ops guys. And they teach you a lot of stuff, like how to identify weaponry, how to make your way through a minefield.
I'd be out right there.
What to do during mortar attacks, what to do if you're taken hostage, how to negotiate with hostage takers, what to say, what not to say, how to vet people, like how do you know if somebody's telling you they can be your guide? How do you know they're not a bad guy who's going to lead you right into the enemy den? So that training was very useful to me, especially the stuff about weaponry and stuff. I grew up in a non-military home. I remember the first time I got to Fort Stewart, I had this little cheat sheet of Army ranks because I didn't know how to even read ranks on uniforms. And I knew I'd be in trouble if I didn't call somebody by their right rank. If I called a staff sergeant a sergeant, or if I called if I confused a major with a captain, so I learned from scratch. And all this Army, from being in the military loves to use jargon and acronyms, and I knew none of that. And it was a learning experience for me. But by the end of it all, I was they even got me Army tags because they said, "Oh, you've done it all now with us." So,
this kind of goes into my question I had too in this vein is like, so, and again, without going into too much detail, like when you have to go with them and there's engagement or some kind of conflict, like, do they put you in a safe place? Or are they like, come over here. You don't want to be there? Or are you just like on your own? How do you navigate like a conflict situation like that safely?
Yeah. So no, I would have conversations. So let's say I've been put into a 4-man Humvee, right? I'm taking the place of one of the soldiers. So that in itself was problematic to me. Like this truck would have had 5 guys in it, and now it has 4 guys, 3 guys and a gunner because I'm occupying one of the seats. So I better know how to act. So I would talk to the platoon sergeant or whoever was in charge of the certain mission and find out, like, if this happens, we would do all these hypotheticals. If A happens, what do I do? If B happens, what do I do? Where do you want me? Do you want me to just like drop to the floor and just stay there? Or do you want me, what do I do? What if we get caught in a crossfire? What if we roll over an IED? Well, all those things, so I think I always talked to, whoever was in charge. I would go to their drills, before they went out on combat missions, they would have, a drill session where they would talk through what they were doing, what the mission was about, what could go wrong, all of those things. So I think every journalist who does that, is smart enough to do that. I mean, I remember going out on patrol with a unit in Abu Ghraib late at night in an area where there were a lot of snipers on rooftops. And I just learned how to do the dance. Like I would pick the, whoever was in my truck, or in that case, it was a mechanized unit, so a Bradley. And I would pick someone and say, okay, I'm going to hang with you, and I would just like whatever he did, I would be right behind him, negotiating the road. Yeah. So because I didn't, journalists don't carry weapons.
That was my next question.
We don't carry weapons, and I don't know how to. I'm not a soldier, and so the best thing I could do is stick behind someone who knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
So how are you
That
viewed? How are
takes
you viewed in that?
guts.
How are you viewed in that situation? Okay, you're there. You're doing a job. You have a job to do, but you're also taking the place of somebody who is kind of part of the machinery, right? So
Yeah.
how do they? I mean, did you meet a lot of resistance? Was it? I mean, or just kind
So
of?
yeah, it depended on the unit. I mean, some of the guys were like, "What is she doing here? You know, we don't need a reporter here." And others were much more receptive, you know, to having me there because they wanted their stories told.
Mm-hmm,
So,
mm-hmm.
you know, it's pretty easy to figure out who is going to be friendly and who's not. And I would talk to the commander and say, I want to be in truck number 3 or truck, you know, whatever. I would figure out guys who were talkative versus guys who weren't.
Right.
There wasn't much point to being with a unit where nobody was going to talk to you, right?
Mm-hmm,
So,
mm-hmm.
yeah, so it was, you know, maybe the first few days were a little uncomfortable, but then you figure out, I mean, I'm spending like 24/7 with them. So it was very easy to figure out who was gonna, be good for me to stick with and who
Right.
was gonna just like, I don't want you here. Oftentimes I'd get there and they would say, "Are you the new Iraqi interpreter?" And I'd say, "No, I'm the American journalist." And they would look at me going, "Okay,
That's
well,
crazy.
you don't look like the American journalist who was supposed to be embedded with us." And I said, "What did you expect?" You know, I
Yeah.
think they all expected some, you know, white dude to show up, and then they got me.
Yeah.
So what do they? So what's the communication like between who you're working for that's sending you there and the military? Like, does the military have to clear? Like, do they have to say, "Hey, we want to put one of our reporters in blah 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 place and blah blah unit," or do you just show up? I mean, like, how do you? Somebody's got to know you're coming, right?
Oh, no. The embedding process is a lot of bureaucracy involved with that. Yes, they have to clear you to be with a unit.
Okay.
But once you get to the unit, the military is not censoring your stories or looking at what you're doing.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
But you have to, so, you know, it was always a delicate dance. Like if you got a really good story and you knew that the military wouldn't be happy with it, it's like, do you publish it now and risk being thrown out? I mean, they reserve the right to throw you out at any time.
Right.
Which is what happened to me in 2005 with this 48th Brigade, the year that they were there. There was a cavalry unit that lost 3 soldiers, and I went down to Mahmoudiya where they were based to write about them. And one of the guys who was killed, his teammates, you know, his truck mates were telling me all about it, and I published that story, and then the general was not happy. And I got called into his office and basically told that, you know, I could get thrown out of the brigade.
Wow.
And they put a minder on me, the soldier whose job was to follow me around.
Wow.
Oh, goodness.
And I remember one day I was going into a porta potty and I looked at him and I said, "There's really not room for the both of us in here. So you're going to have to wait outside." But that didn't last very long. I just, you know, I think I spent so much time with them that by the 3rd or 4th time that I was with them, they kind of let me go. And then I figured out there was one unit of the brigade, one company, Charlie Company of 1121, that was based in Baghdad, separate from the headquarters. And so I went and planted myself with them, and the captain there was pretty easygoing. You know, he just said, "Yeah, you just let me know what you're doing and it'll be fine." And
yeah,
that's cool.
So I have a couple questions, and I think we got to kind of start to wind up. But the first is, you must have had, I mean, how many moments did you have where you would be wherever you are, whether it's in whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in India sometimes, even though that's where you're from, doing stuff, and you're like, what the fuck? What am I doing here? Do you ever have? You must have had tons of those moments where you're like, Jesus Christ, what? Wow, that to me, it just blows me away that people find themselves in that situation.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. No one ever forced me to go anywhere. I volunteered,
Right.
right? I wanted to keep going back to Iraq because I felt so compelled to tell the story, tell the story of ordinary Iraqis, to tell the story of American soldiers. I wasn't interested in doing the story from up here about what was happening with the war itself. I just wanted to tell stories from the ground up to make people understand how serious war is. I think in 2005, I came home that year from one of my embeds. I was there for 3 months, and then I came home in October. And I was here October, November, and it was getting near Christmas. And I remember going to this Lenox Square Mall in Atlanta, which is one of the largest malls in the Southeast. And it was Christmas, and everything was lit up, and people were shopping. And there was like I felt so angry because it was like Americans are dying over there, and yet here life is just so freaking normal. And there's like I mean, of course, if you're in a military family, there was a lot of recognition of that. But I think that day in the mall, something snapped in me, and I just said, okay, I'm going to keep covering this story because people need to know. And it's not just about how many Americans die in a war or how many people are injured. It's like if you think about how many families were then affected and how many of those families touch other families. It's like a whole swath of the American public that has been devastated or affected in a negative way from these wars that we fought, and frankly, a war in Iraq that I thought was completely unnecessary, and turned our attention away from the real problem, which was Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. So, and a lot of the guys I was with, a lot of my stories touched on that. Their frustration was, look, our buddies are dying. We're out, going out on, 3-day combat missions, risking our lives every day for what? What is, in World War II, there were front lines. You could see yourself advancing farther and farther into German territory. In these wars, in Afghanistan, Iraq, it was hard to see what we were gaining, right? And that was such a source of frustration for everyone. And it's like, what are we doing here? What good are we doing here? And so that's why, in 2005, I reported on this little girl, this baby this one unit that I was with the 48th Brigade, they found her during a raid of her home in Abu Ghraib. She was born with severe spina bifida, and she would have died if she would have been left without treatment. And they shuttled her out of Iraq to Atlanta for life-saving surgery. Then she was sent back to Iraq. But, and I kept following her. And I went back in 2013 for CNN to do a story about her. Then I went to Uganda in 2017 when she went back there to have more surgery. And that's one reason I want to go back to Iraq now is I want to see her again. But that story, people didn't quite understand the importance of it. To the outside world, it was like saving the life of one girl who might have died. But to those soldiers, that was something tangible that they could hold on to. It was like, oh, look, we did something good. Our time here has not been in vain because we did actually save the life of this
Right.
this child and
Right.
help this family.
Right.
And in a time when this was at the height of the sectarian war in Iraq, and things were really bad, really, really bad in Baghdad. There was ethnic cleansing going on, and the Americans were like, feeling very frustrated. And so in that context, you have to understand the story in that context, what it meant to these guys to be able to do that.
Well, and I think you answered my next question, which is how much do you maintain a lot of contact with these people, be it, the girl that you followed, or like what's going on in their lives or anything, maybe not professionally, so to speak, just in general. You must have a ton, and I don't know, how do you handle that, or do you handle that? And is there contact? Like you talked about the guy that you met in Iraq, and then connected with when he got put in jail for whatever reason, right? So there is, So, or do they maintain?
Yeah, I'm in touch with many of the soldiers that I spent time with. I'm in touch with Noor's family, the Iraqi girl. I intend to go back and see her. I'd like to see her, maybe not as a journalist, but as a human being. I'd like to see how she's doing. And she has a very difficult life. She has no movement at all below her waist, and now she's fully grown woman. So, and she comes from a very poor conservative family. Their main concern was that nobody would marry her, and that somebody in the family would have to take care of her for the rest of her life. And so that's not an easy thing in a place like Iraq. And so my deepest regret is, in the chaos of war, you don't always, you're not able to maintain contact with people, because people have phone numbers that come and go, or there was no email then, or, and so I wish I was in contact with more people that I met. But yes, I am in contact with several people in Iraq and India and Haiti and other places. I've been to all, and I always think one day maybe I'm going to go back and see how you're doing. I think that's a really important part of journalism that a lot of journalists don't do. We like to cover, you see all these stories that are, get the headlines of houses drowned by hurricanes and tornadoes and disaster and murder and all this horrible stuff that happens to human beings. We cover the actual act itself, but very few of us go back to people. And to me, that's the real story about human resilience and how people come back from tragedy. That to me is a much more powerful story than covering the actual disaster itself.
But also, not only professionally, but I imagine personally, like you said, you want to go back on your own, not professionally, not to do a story, just to check on her. And I mean, you talk about, look at Haiti now, right? I mean, there's no earthquake, but the shit's hitting the fan out there, right? So you must know people there, and hopefully you're able to. To me, I would have a very. I'm like, wow, I would get so caught up in what about this guy? What about that guy? Or this family, that family. So, wow, it's heavy.
But, also, I mean, as journalists, you have to, I mean, there is a line, right? It's going back to what we were talking about. I was in their lives, not as their friend, but as a journalist.
Right.
And it's important for me to maintain the right amount of distance for that, I think a lot of journalists, some of the best journalists in America today who do this kind of journalism, which is deep, immersive journalism, like, for instance, Eli Saslow of the New York Times or David Finkel at the Washington Post, they will tell you that that's very important to maintain that distance. You are there as an observer of someone's life. You're not there to save them. That's not your role.
Right.
You're not there to help them. You're not there. This girl that I wrote about in Iraq, sure, people wanted to help her, and I facilitated, connecting people, but I wasn't going to send her a wheelchair myself. That wasn't my role. My role was to tell her story.
Okay. So what's next for you now? What's happening? Are
Well,
you are you
I'm
teaching now, right? Still.
yeah, I'm the director of an MFA program in narrative nonfiction. Our students, it's a low residency program, which means that you don't have to interrupt your life to do this program. And so we get students from all walks of life. Some of our students are in their 20s, others are in their 70s. Some are experienced journalists, others are not. All sorts of life experiences, backgrounds. Anyway, that program, some people are writing books in that program. Some people are writing long magazine stories. It keeps me very busy. I enjoy that immensely, having that back and forth with my students. I also teach undergrad classes at UGA. That also keeps me very busy. And as I said, I try to freelance story. So I'm in the process of reporting and writing a story right now that I'm hoping to publish soon.
All right.
And other than that, I have a dog. I spend a lot of time with my dog. He's my furry son.
We heard about him.
I like to take long walks because I have all sorts of issues with my body now, and so I can't do pounding exercise, so I take long walks instead. And I also like to think a lot about what I'm doing on my walks. And so
you got an amazing story, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's hard to put it into 90 minutes. That's like like a lot of people is just touching on it. I hope I get the chance to meet you sometime. Mike and I are always, every time I talk to him, he says, well, you're not far, from Atlanta. When I'm up there, we'll have to go out there, whatever you say, up, out, down. Yeah. So maybe someday I'm sure it'll happen. And, Shane will tell you just never know where in the world I'll turn up. So who knows? Who knows? So
where are you actually?
Well, at the moment, I'm just in Delaware. I have a house in Delaware. I have a place in Portugal, and maybe working on one more.
Where in Portugal?
It's right outside Porto, on the beach in a city called Matosinhos. So pretty nice.
And I'm in North Carolina.
Yep, Shane's out in North Carolina.
Where in North Carolina?
On the coast, Emerald Isle.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're close, and I have a trainer out there in Atlanta, so there's always an excuse to get into that neck of the woods. So you never know, or vice versa. You could come out here. I'm an hour from Philly, an hour from DC.
Atlanta is changed so much since I moved here in 1990. I just heard on the news today. Now we're the 6th largest metropolitan area in the country, and I really like Atlanta for a lot of reasons. Where I live right in the city, and it's very diverse and multicultural, and I love my neighborhood. I walk to a lot of things. And
which neighborhood are you in there?
I live in Morningside, which is kind of like Midtown, right next to Piedmont Park.
Yeah, I know it. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, we just spent time with my trainer in Atlanta and talking about a few places we want to go. We want to go visit out there when I come into town again. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. But yeah, it's a cool place for sure. I've spent some time out there. Well, Moni, thank you so much. We'll get this up probably on Monday or something like that, and do a little work on it. I'll put a bio in and everything.
It was okay. I don't know. I'm not ever interested in my own life. So.
Well, geez, I mean,
should be, because it is one hell of a. I'm not ever going to tell anybody what I do forever again.
Yeah, for sure.
Because they don't touch nothing that you got going on.
We'll and when we get the chance to meet, we'll talk about like what's it like dealing with a dog trainer as a boyfriend. That's gotta be fun. So that could be a whole other 90 minutes at least. Well, thank you again so much, and I'm gonna hit stop here, and then we'll chat for a quick moment. Okay. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Keep your computer open.
Yep.
For a minute.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to this edition of the Butt Fixer Podcast. Stay tuned for more guests, more stories, and more butt fixes. Make sure you click like, subscribe, and follow at all of the places where you stream podcasts.